establish some of the kind of basic building blocks of the environment, getting in some grass plains, some of our larger kind of cliff structures. We're going to want to start throwing in some trees and feel how kind of a forest is really going to change the look of our space. So of course we want to get to our foliage painter tool, select our trees, and then kind of come in here and make sure we have some good min-max values. Let's try 0.9 and maybe 1.3. And of course we want to make sure that our density and our spacing is set to something that'll work out well. So let's see kind of how that is. All right, that's pretty good. Now this is really only utilizing one tree. The more trees you have, the more variety you're going to kind of get out of your space. So we can just throw in a whole nother tree there just to get a different feeling and a different vibe in this environment. So we'll want to set up similar settings. So maybe 5, spacing radius of, let's say, another 5 as well. We're going to want to remove the align to normals, which is right there. And now with both selected, when we paint, we'll get both of these trees. Now one of these is pretty large tree, so we might want to avoid that. So now we're just really utilizing one tree, and of course we can add more to get a bit more variety, but I think one for right now should be fine. So we'll want to figure out where we want to have our trees to be laid out. Generally trees are going to like to grow either near water and in open space. You will get them in mountains and mountainous regions, but you're going to get a bit less along those kind of cliff edges, as there's a bit less soil and a bit less earth for them to kind of grow in, take root, and kind of just grow in general. So do keep that in mind. When you are adding things along a cliff edge and along a mountainside, you will have them there, of course, but the density might not be as strong as they would be in a kind of open plain. You also don't want to totally obscure your view of any important elements in your scene with large amounts of trees and foliage if you're trying to highlight any given area. If we've made this river, we might not want to put, just this massive forest right here, because we can no longer see it. But a great thing about a river with its movement is when you do create kind of a row of trees and you get a few in there, you will get this feeling of movement behind there. And it just, again, is drawing the player to that area. They're seeing that movement. They're curious as, what is that? Is that anything important? I want to go check out this river and kind of explore around the space. So it's a great way to kind of like highlight these areas without being overbearing and getting some of your environment lost. So we're just going to throw in some trees here. We still want to keep these, cliffs here in the background, as they are a interesting aspect, but we do want to put some trees in there and make this area feel pretty dense. Come back here, and for areas back here, if the player can never get up to maybe say this ledge or this ledge up here, we of course can use the trick of scaling down our trees to kind of fake the height of them, to give a illusion that the trees are larger than they actually are, and this space is a larger space than we can ever actually really experience. You get the kind of faked effect of having a nice big open environment without needing to keep everything to scale and having them actually be a massive environment. We of course will still want to utilize kind of our clumping techniques in our spaces. We want to clump a bunch of assets together and not just have a whole bunch of noise. And we can even utilize that with our trees. We want to create areas of large density and areas of kind of less density, a bit more rest in our space. If we're getting too many trees over here and we're like, all right, maybe we need to cut some of these down, give a little bit more space for the eyes to kind of rest, and then have just like the few interspurted trees, it'll just give you a more organic, nicer feeling area. Now for these large cliffs here, again, we can make these even smaller trees to again just accentuate the height factor of this environment. Put that at maybe 0.6, and then just start to pepper in some trees along the top. When we come back here, now this large cliff already feels more grandiose than when it was without the trees. It's just given a lot more height to it and a lot more scale. You, of course, can never really get up onto this ledge, but now already, you're getting this feeling that these trees are just huge, massive trees on the side of this really big cliff. And you, of course, can remove some of them, as again, we don't want them all over the place and just to feel like we're hitting a wall of trees, but we do want to create some visual interest on a bunch of these different types of planes. And always just kind of check the main view if it's your kind of camera view that you're really trying to nail down, as just so you can get a good sense of what the space is looking like and how it's feeling. Now we will want to come in and enter into our man-made space and break up a lot of this tiling in here. We, of course, can do that with different types of shaders we can add. I've added this leaf texture as well that helps blend the area between the kind of dirt as well as the grass. And so it's not just binary of grass and then dirt. I can use this texture in there to kind of feather it off and get a nice blend of where leaves and mulch are starting to kind of grow, where the grass is kind of fading out into some dirt, and it feels like areas that have been walked on a little bit more so than just like the dirt that we have here in the middle or the grass plains themselves. And this, of course, is just going to help us nicely break up the tiling in our environment, as that is one of the biggest things, is trying to mask away the tiling that you have and that you'll see in pretty much any space you build. You can utilize that with either different assets or just tiling textures. You can remove a lot of the tiling look by utilizing different assets or different textures. So we're just going to want to kind of break up a lot of this heavy looked rock area and start to play around with the different leaves on top of them. It's always a great way to kind of go in and paint some details and then essentially come back with another texture that's very similar and erase it. You can do the same with the kind of cliff edges to help fade them out. Just going to break up the kind of straight lines that are in there and help smooth out and make it feel like there's more cliff underneath a lot of these areas that's not really exposed. We're just going to drag it out. I'm going to feather it out so it's no longer either just instantly rock and then dirt or rock and then grass. We're going to help spread this out just so it feels like the different areas are kind of chipping away. Of course, we can then come in with our dirt and then kind of break it up even more. some of these areas, we do want to have them feel like, there's not really much grass there. It is a lot more of just kind of dirt, and it's been worn away. Of course, you just always want to like play with the strength as well, just so you can get some kind of variation in a lot of these areas. Again, we're just trying to break up a lot of the tiling and give some nice organic feeling to our spaces, dragging the dirt down these kind of cliff slides into our main space. It's all about trying to tie one area into the next. And so this is kind of what a lot of environments are really built like. You're just utilizing a lot of the textures and shaders that you already have, and you're just kind of going in there and kind of painting, breaking up this tiling, trying to make each section feel connected together without being overbearing and on top of each other. Of course, we can then come in here again with our small rock pebbles and really start to break that up as well. Makes this area feel like the rocks have just kind of chipped away and gone from larger boulders into these smaller pebbles. We can also utilize, again, going from our large, medium to small assets, our larger rocks, as well as our rubble pile. So again, our large cliffs are our main shapes, and then our boulders here are kind of medium secondary shapes, with our rubble piles kind of being our tertiary shapes. We can also make even smaller rocks that just kind of fit into different given areas to really help break it up even further. As you don't always need your cliffs to really be your only large shapes. If, say, this boulder right here was your large shape, your rubble pile was your medium shape, these small little scree rock piles can easily be your tertiary third shape. So you just want to think about that and feel how each element can go together, and again, create that nice gradient feeling, just so it doesn't feel like these are just large rocks just smashed in the ground and nothing has helped blending them together. Now, if you've gone through and scaled a bunch of these rock assets and you've placed some and you're like, okay, I like, this one place here, it's got a good scale, but I want kind of my default scaling back. You can easily do that by just going onto the mesh attributes side over here on the other panel, and then just clicking the reset to default. And you can easily and quickly get back to whatever your default settings are. It's a great little quick trip. It's a great little tip that can help you speed up some of these assets and just getting a bunch of different variation in there. So you can bring in some of these rocks in here, and of course we can vary the scale up however we need. Much like the trees, these large rock boulders, if they are kind of outside the plane space, we can scale them up to essentially almost any size we want, as long as the texture resolution still holds up, and get this feeling of large kind of rocky boulders in a far away area, or scale them really small and then get them to look really tiny and give the kind of cliffs next to them a much grander feel. All right, let's go ahead now and check out another time lapse of just building the rest of this environment out. We kind of went through the slow process of, hitting our base main forms, and now I just wanted to quickly go through and show how I kind of go through this area, adding in these secondary and kind of medium-sized details throughout the environment. So I'm just trying to like blend in some of these larger primary shapes. I'm putting in bigger rocks and boulders and then kind of sculpting the terrain around them to feel and flow a little bit better. I want to kind of create this nice transition of these massive cliffs down to these larger boulders, as well as eventually into the kind of ground itself. You can then even paint with the painting tool on some of the larger rock assets themselves, and of course eventually come in there and spot fix out some of those blending. Now I've gone in here and used my smaller rocks to kind of help blend out even the medium shapes out, just to get a nice first pass in there, just to kind of get a better feel of what the space can be. You don't want to just go instantly rocks, dirt, grass, and that's it. Having that kind of transition of these nice smaller pebbles is really going to help out. I'm also feathering out the kind of wetness on the shoreline, as you don't want just a straight line. You want to just kind of feel like some areas are a little bit sunken down and they kind of bleed out the water into the surrounding areas. Now, again, going back through and just doing the entire process of kind of trying to remove a lot of the looks of the tiling in some of these spaces, utilizing multiple layers of these different textures that we've created in our landscape material to really help blend out the scene. Again, just a first pass, we can go in there and detail out these areas a lot more later, but we want to get a really good first pass and a good foundation. It'll really help set the kind of tone and mood of our scene, as well as just give us a quick understanding of what it's really going to look like. If you just keep these things really loose and fast, you can get through a lot of different iterations really quickly and not have to be worried about being married to any one kind of decision you made. You just focus in on one area and basically are like, all right, I'm going to bring this to extreme polish forever. And you spent maybe a day or two detailing a section out. Then you look at the whole and you're like, well, actually, this kind of sucks. It's not working. Maybe the lighting's wrong. Maybe, it just doesn't have a cool shape or a form in there. A lot of the details are competing and it's mixing the message. And then you have to really go back in and basically undo a lot of that work. So if you just keep these details loose, you quickly kind of blend out some of these areas just to get a feel of what your blends can be, where you need different textures, where you're going to need some more smaller detail assets to help break up those large areas of tiling. This is a great way to do that. You just quickly throw them in. Even here in the middle, we've got this medium-sized boulder, and we want to kind of fan it out with some of these smaller rock assets. We're trying to keep the clumping as well to given specific areas. So if we pause the video right here, we can see that where the boulder is now that I have selected, it has a nice large patch of kind of this grassy field there. That's a nice like clump and a large patch. And then if you look to our left, we have this kind of like clumping and patch of trees. It gives a nice read, simple, it's not too noisy and busy. And you can just go through the environment and create these different kind of clumping and patched areas throughout your scene. If we look in the back, of course, just from this view itself, we have this large kind of clumping of all these really large cliffs and boulders and rock faces. That in itself is its own kind of patch, and it leads to one really nice clean read of all these large granite structures. And of course, you will want to do the same with the medium-sized boulders, either down at the base of them or out in the middle of the field. You want to kind of clump all of those, a little bit closer together so you don't just have details spread out all over the place, creating a lot of noise. So here, I'm just in my main camera view that, kind of establishing the shot. It's generally pretty easy to create an environment when you're just focusing on one area. And so I just want to kind of go in there, and since this is a first pass to the scene, to just really focus in and try and get something really cool from this one angle. Now, of course, with a 3D environment in a game setting, it's unlike a movie where, you just have that one angle. You're going to have to check out the scene from every different angle. Every space that the player can be, you're going to have to check out and make sure it looks interesting. But for those touchstone moments, you're going to want to make some areas, of course, stand out. And those are generally pathing areas where the player might come through and enter this valley. So if there was a road here that led into our scene that we set up as our kind of camera angle, that would be something you'd want to focus on and add a lot of detail, create some really nice shapes and story moments that can easily be read really quickly. It's a great way to just kind of get this idea across in these hallway moments. Even if you have a big outdoor environment, you kind of come around a bend, you see this area and you're like, all right, this is where I would like basically take my picture from. Where if I was a photographer in a field, I would take my photo from there. Now, that isn't to say you want to neglect the other spaces. However, those moments are great areas to kind of just highlight and add in that extra detail. We can even use areas outside of this space to help reinforce this kind of single shot view by putting some of those trees on the outlying sections. So we can see here, we've got this pretty good first pass going on. And of course, there's definitely more to do. But for kind of like just spending about an hour's worth of time in this scene, 45 minutes to an hour, we got a really good foundation to build on. We, of course, are really mainly focusing on this one view, which many of you might tend to do for whatever your kind of focal point shot is going to be. But you're going to want to make sure that you leave the surrounding areas as interesting as well. Just, of course, those focal point areas are going to be your kind of touchstone moments. Those are going to be the areas where you'd enter into a scene, enter into, say, this little valley, and you'd want to make sure it's, a really gorgeous shot. So this is a great way to go about doing it. You set your camera, you make a really appealing image in one scene, but then you go through the rest of the space and make sure you detail it out to the same, not only level, but also just that it has this organic flow to the space. To finish things up, we can just adjust some of the grass tinting here, so we just get things a little bit more in line, and then we have a pretty nice scene to kind of work with and go off from there. Now that we've spent some time building out quickly our environment, we have a good base and a good establishing point to go further from this initial first pass, and then eventually take it on to a medium detailing and then final detailing phase. You'll want to go through your environment after you do a nice block out like this and kind of go back and pick out areas that are potentially not working, maybe need some more detail and some more love. So you just want to figure out where your environment is working. Are your reads working well? Are you being drawn to the kind of focal points of the scene? And are the implied lines throughout your environment that are being created helping draw you in or out of the image? We have lines such as the kind of cliff rocks here, the tree lines themselves kind of going in a teepee-like direction, which definitely mirrors our teepees in our scene. We have the river that helps lead the viewer to believe that the space is larger and more complex than it really is. We have a lot of the kind of secondary forms helping point towards our directional focal point, which are these rocks. They're all kind of like leading in different directions towards our focal point area. A lot of these implied and suggested lines are just helping draw you into this focal area, as well as, of course, the bright color of the teepees. Again, this is, a good first pass. Some keys to think about when you're going about your space is you're going to want to make sure that you look at every direction, see what's working. Obviously, right here, things are not working really well as they were not handled. So you'll want to make sure that as a player, when you're in a space, you want to be able to look around everywhere and feel a good sense of place in the world. You'll want to be able to feel like this is a real natural space and that everything kind of ties together. Nothing really sticks out, and it feels like there are plenty of different spaces within your environment, such as these little grass plains right here and these more rocky, shelved cliff areas that just kind of separate and differentiate each other from themselves. So everything's not the same. Everything has kind of a unique flavor and feel to it, and they feel like these large cliffs are here. This earth has been like eroding around it. Large boulders break off. Those boulders shatter into smaller rubble pieces. It leads way to kind of open plains without these large cliff faces where trees and other plants have a chance to grow, as well as a river that kind of cuts through and leads eventually into, our next area, which was the slot canyon. So you'll want to think about these things, how your environment ties together, how it's essentially all kind of constructed, and what you can do to improve and add upon it. Maybe you need to take away some of these trees over here as it's getting a little too noisy, or you might want to clear up this area over here with these trees, give a little bit more viewing room towards your river, and just kind of focus on maybe some larger bushes or plants or ferns. Once you've kind of figured out and made sure all your reads are really well, you can then go in and start doing a secondary pass, trimming out some of these details, adding in some new secondary details such as more ferns, more plants, more flowers, smaller props for your man-made objects. Remember, you want to think about how these man-made objects are incorporated in the world. You don't want to just have a bunch of teepees in a grass field and there's grass all around here at the bottom, as that's generally not what would happen when you have people living in these kind of teepees, in these houses, in, even in some ruins. There are going to be signs of human interaction, human footprints that kind of trample down these grasses or plants and kind of clear away so that they have a place to kind of like live and play, and it feels like this is the area that they belong and that they spend most of their time. And of course they would travel down, this more beaten path down here to the river to fish, to gather water, and just kind of live in this environment. So you'll want to keep your kind of natural details a little bit more sparse around some of these man-made objects, or keep them in areas that you just wouldn't see as much foot traffic, such as maybe the backsides of these teepees. Again, this is a really good medium kind of like first pass of a space that you can then go in, start adding in a lot of those extra character details, those flowers, those plants that will really help it pop and give a lot more life. In reality, this scene was really built with just a large cliff, one tree, a large boulder, a rubble pile boulder, two different types of grass, and some teepees along with this terrain. So really there are just only a few assets in here, and you can already see how far along you can get. The more assets you add, the more believability you're going to get from your environment, as it's not just all going to feel the same. You're not going to just notice this, kind of grass everywhere. You're going to start to see some flowers, some weeds, some, dead grass, everything to just really mix it up and make it feel organic and alive. Let's reflect and recap on what we learned this week. So in this week, we start out learning about mask shaders and how we can utilize these shaders to create some different unique assets without needing a diffuse texture. You can utilize a mask to mask out the, say, dirt of the ground on an asset, as well as areas that you want to be stone or rock, or even mossy, sandy, snowy, whatever it could be. You can mask them out and utilize the same kind of textures to have the exact same look as whatever your landscape is. This is great for rubble piles, things of that nature. We then took a look at rivers and discussed all the kind of concepts behind rivers and how we want to utilize them in our scenes to build out our environment. We started by talking about how we can lead the eye with rivers as well as roads. Roads are very interchangeable with rivers in this regard. You can help lead an eye through a space with a river or a road as it draws a nice straight line, or not even straight line, but just a nice line that helps bridge through a lot of the kind of noise of your normal organic environment. It kind of cuts through and it draws a line that helps guide the player's eye to where you want them to see. This can either be to a destination point, around a corner, so they have some sense of there's more beyond just the space I'm in, or just kind of having it as a good kind of touchstone in an area that the player can draw a mental map in their mind about where they are in this world. We looked also at the placement of man-made assets around rivers and how oftentimes the flaw is to just put them right next to the waterfront, right where if the water ever flooded from either heavy rain, flash floods, melted snow and ice in the ice caps, that these areas would just be totally flooded, and it kind of ruins a bit of the believability. It's understood that a lot of people want to be able to include their man-made assets really close to their rivers and kind of like bodies of water, as they have a nice contrast with them of having these man-made assets and water. They want to show off those details, but having them on a kind of raised up berm or a slight hill can definitely lead to a more believable scene, as it's generally where people build their kind of man-made structures, their houses, anything of that nature, as you don't want them to be flooded with water. We then took a look at environment creation, and we went through the process of going from just our simple little landscape to adding a bunch of assets to get a nice first pass on a space. We started with our primary reeds, our large structures, sculpting them into the ground a bit more so they felt a little bit more cohesive with our large rock formations. We also put in focal point assets such as the teepees in the example I was giving, as well as the dirt kind of plains where it is the base of kind of the teepees where people would congregate and it would crush down any kind of foliage that was there. We also threw in our rivers and just kind of sculpted around that. We then started blending in our primary shapes with our secondary shapes. Put in our larger boulders, our rubble piles, getting our trees and our kind of areas designated for each kind of like forest section, as well as putting in just some quick large swaths of grass. We then started landscape blending. We took our shaders that we've created for our landscape material and started to help blending them together. We want to get rid of a lot of the tiling look in those textures, so we started blending them on top of each other, blending from large stone to rocks to dirt to kind of a mix of grass and dirt and then back to grass. And having all of these different textures and being able to blend together gives you a much better sense of kind of placement and not this harsh contrast of just grass, dirt, and rock. We also utilize smaller foliage pieces to kind of help blend the transition, blend from our main grass clumps down to just faded out grass and then into just normal texture work. All this was a really good first pass of the details we needed to create our environment. We want to start off and have a good foundation, and then we can kind of work and essentially kind of like a clay object, we're going to start to then mold it into our final detail where we want. We've got our big forms in there now, our first detail pass of everything. We're going to start to just eventually chip away, refine our kind of secondary shapes and our detail assets, and then just add in extra little spurts here and there that really kind of help pop our environment. Now let's take a look at the assignment for this week. So this week it's going to be a little bit different as there isn't exactly any kind of asset that you need to create this week. It's going to be mainly focused on building out your environment. However, that being said, we do want to see 1 to 2 man-made assets for the focal points of your shot. You should already know what these are based on your references that you got together in the first week. So hopefully there will be something that they're fairly easy to put in. We don't want anything too crazy like a super massive temple complex. You can do that kind of like later down the road if you really want to expand this environment. But we want 1 to 2 assets made that can help solidify your environment and give a feeling of cohesion with these man-made objects. So you just demonstrate the ability to blend your organic environment into the man-made assets. You also want to demonstrate your knowledge of utilizing leading lines with kind of rivers, roads, and trails. Now, you don't need this to be a river itself, but using a road or a kind of dirt trail are great ways to lead lines and create paths for the eye to follow throughout your environment. And you can utilize this to really draw the eye around to different areas of interest and focal point intensity in your scene. We'll also want to see a first pass on both the focal points of your sections of your environment. We established what our focal points were going to be in the first class, so we just want to kind of get a really good first pass on both of these focal points. And that's pretty much it for this week. Again, it's really just starting to nail in your environment, getting all the foundation laid, making sure you're getting good, quick first passes on pretty much everything, and getting everything in your scene together so you can just kind of feel how things are harmonizing together, what's working, what's not, what you're going to need to change. And this is kind of the time you're definitely going to want to do it as things come together really quickly. And so we want to see all these assets really working together and what you're missing and lacking and need to bring in to kind of finalize your scene and bring it to a really nice completion.